operate and maneuver the ship. But they're often appointed with these wonderful carved headpieces on the ends of the ship to announce their relationship to the gods in the afterlife. This is another headpiece from a Viking ship. Another here. Now, the oars could be stored in these containers and pushed through these holes as needed, or the ship could use sails and allowing the wind to move them. We get the word starboard side to a ship from the Vikings because they had a little board which had all the stars kind of checked out on it, and that's how they could tell where they were on the ocean. So they would go to the starboard and look at the board and check it against the sky. When it was overcast, they had another method. They had a lodestone, and they could actually chart and navigate without using the sun or the moon, using the lodestone. No other people on the water had this device. No people until after the age of explorers had any clue about how to do this. Well, this is a Viking ship that was built to hold 80 men. And another. And this is a smaller ship, probably for about 36 people. Not much left of this one, but you get the feel for, they feel almost like you're looking at a fish, the skeleton of a fish. You know, they're very much in tune with nature. This one would be a small one for 2 people. Beautifully crafted, the workmanship on this wood, and it lasts, as I said, this is over 1,000 years old. And that's one of those little rooms that would have been on the top of the ship for getting in out of the weather or dealing with anything at all. When somebody was they were sleeping, they could be in here, and the other people could be rowing the ship. And what these are actually tent poles. The Vikings would set these up on the ground and then drape cloth or animal skins over a center pole, and that was how they made their tents. But as an artist, I think this is the most exquisite form. It's as beautiful as any sculpture I've ever seen, and it's the bow of one of their ships. It's just absolutely, it looks like it's a knife that's designed to cut through a piece of cake. You know, it's a really exquisite piece of engineering. And again, here is the steering mechanism, which could be moved from the front to the back of the boat. So, well, this is the your keel, so you could adjust it, but it was movable, going to one side or the other of the boat. So now this is Lindisfarne, the site of the Vikings' appearance on history. And as they appear in history, the story that's told about them is basically they're just about the worst thing going. And this is Lindisfarne again. And this is the image of the Vikings that we still know today. This is Leif Erikson. Now, Leif Erikson was obviously a famous and talented explorer, a troubled person probably as well, because some of his exploration is based on the fact that he killed someone where he was living and he was ordered to leave, and he took his band of followers with him and discovered Iceland and started to establish Iceland. Things didn't go as well for him in Iceland as he wanted, and he ended up moving on to Greenland. When he got to Greenland, he named it Greenland because he thought it was a better idea than another cold place. So he wanted to get more Vikings to come there. So he made it sound better than it really was. Now, it was a little warmer in that era than it became in our time, but when he got there, they quickly set up cutting down trees and establishing farms exactly as they would have had in Norway or Copenhagen, Denmark, etc. The problem with that is that when the weather was warmer, it wasn't too bad. But over a period of 400 years that the Vikings occupied Greenland, what occurred is that in Greenland, the Viking settlement the Viking couldn't have their cows outside for much more than a month or two a year. And so they kept them in these little stone barns, and the cows got smaller and smaller. They were down to 4 feet tall, and they had to be dug out of their own waste every spring because they were basically packed into this little stone building they had spent the winter in, and you couldn't get the waste out of it, right? So what actually happened is that the Viking settlement failed after 450 years for the most ironic of things, which was that apparently Leif Erikson had a food allergy to fish. So he made it against the law to eat fish. You're living in the North Atlantic, and he made that a rule, and the Vikings stuck to it. Meanwhile, in the northern part of the island here, the Inuits were doing just fine, but down here, the Vikings were starving, and the cows were too small, and essentially they threw in the towel after 450 years and begged for relief to get out of there. So, but the Viking voyages are impressive. They sail from Scandinavia, Iceland, and then on to Greenland, and then on to North America. Now, when I was a student, this was a disputed topic. It's not disputed anymore. It's an absolute fact. They arrived in Canada, Newfoundland. They also came down into Massachusetts, Maine, and maybe as far south as New York State. We found hard evidence. Clearly, they were here in 980 AD, long before Christopher Columbus was even thinking about making a journey. So they do deserve credit for being the first ones over. Their problem was that in this great voyage that they had made, what they were really doing was they were coming from here, going there, to find trees to build ships and to build things. And so they were lugging lumber back from Newfoundland. They weren't trying to establish a permanent colony. It was just a place where they were getting wood. And one of the reasons for that was the North Atlantic really doesn't produce a lot of trees. And as I said, the climate was changing. It was getting colder. And so North America offered a bountiful supply. The other problem that the Vikings were having in this part of the world is that when they were in this area, making all these little settlements, you had to be able to get back, and the winters got harder and harder. Crossing the ocean got more and more difficult. But this is a Viking settlement in Newfoundland, the same kind of houses that we find in Scandinavia and northern England. Now, this is a welcome party of Vikings arriving. As I said, their ships could land right on the beach, and their happy members would jump off and come up to greet you. And the deal that they would offer you, as I said, is essentially you either want to trade or it's going to be a full raid. And that was it. The Vikings were interested in either of the two. The Viking experience in North America, we know from the Viking sagas, is that Leif Erikson and his band encountered 10 Indians, and unfortunately for the Indians and maybe for us in general, is that they killed 9 of the 10. And one got away, and he came back with a lot of his friends. And when that occurred, the Vikings decided that maybe North America was less desirable, so they hugged the coastline and really didn't go inland very far because they found dealing with the Indians rather problematic. And so, it may have gone very differently had it been a different person than Leif Erikson, but as I said, Leif Erikson is historically, what we know about him is he was quick to act with his sword, and He might have been a hell of a good seaman, and he may have been a very adventurous guy, but he was probably not the best representative for opening a new trade policy. All right? Vikings became legends in Europe for their fighting prowess, so they were quickly being hired to fight for other people. And they were among the first mercenaries in Northern Europe. Now, all the parts of Europe that were involved in Viking enterprise are not just Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, etc. Great Britain was divided in half for almost 200 years, and the northern part of Great Britain was called Daneland, and it was 100% a Danish colony. If you go today in Britain, every town that has the word gate at the end or the word by at the end, those are Viking words referring to farms. Okay, so these are Viking settlements that got turned into English settlements later on. The genetic testing of the people of northern Britain is 79% test positive for Scandinavian blood. That's a pretty high percentage. But if you talk to the Irish Englishmen, they really didn't have much of an impact. And the Battle of Hastings in 1066, which is the end of the Viking era, least we forget that William the Conqueror was a Norman, but a Norman is really a Norwegian who was living in France. So again, the Vikings come back to England again and in another way, and then these men participate in dispelling the myth of the Vikings and saying the Vikings didn't have much importance, didn't mean very much, because what they want to do is become Englishmen, because William the Conqueror wanted to dominate Great Britain. And the best way you could do it is say, we belong here. This is our land. We're not for those people, we're these people. But in truth, he was not. And so this is a map that shows, a series of very quick events in 1066. The first Herodota was the first of the battles to seize control with Harold, and then comes William. So within a few days, all of this is changing hands, and the final battle taking place on October the 14th, and the British noblemen acquiescing and giving over, accepting William as the great conqueror. But as I said, he's a Norman. He's a Norseman. The word Norman gets associated with Normandy, but it's again a misname. It's coming from Norway, and this is a characteristic of a Norman castle from the age of around this time. And I want you to also to, if we remember, this is 1066, miraculously the same time frame for when the First Crusade is about to take place. And one of the things that the Crusaders needed was boats. And who made these boats? Those guys who had the shipbuilding skills that came from Scandinavia. Because England was not famous for its boats after the Romans left. There's a long, quiet period there where there's no sea activity at all. It's basically farming, and that's about as far as it goes. But these Norman castles, this map shows what happens here. They come out of Scandinavia, and I've already asserted that they go to the New World, but they come down here, and they sail around the Iberian Peninsula, and they come up into the Mediterranean. At the same time, they go down the great rivers, the Volga and the Oder River, and they sail down to Constantinople over here and down into Italy. And we actually find Norman castles down in Sicily. The Normans came down there and established, they realized that the governments in Sicily were incompetent, and it didn't take them very long to just set up, take over, and take charge. And so if you go to Sicily today, you'll come into these Norman castles that they look like the same castles you see out here on the coast of Ireland and Scotland. Now, this again, a modern image of what Viking fighters must have been like. What we do know about Vikings is they had extremely well-developed upper bodies. Their skeletons reveal extremely strong upper body strength. I would argue that that's obvious if you're using a rowing machine most of the time. You're going to get to be awfully bulky. But again, these Norman castles that enable us today to really see the impact. One of the other features of the Vikings, besides their occupation of much of Great Britain, they founded Dublin, they founded Moscow, they founded Kiev, and they founded much of what is known today as Ireland. Dublin was a Viking stronghold. When there was trouble anywhere in the Viking world, a message would be sent to Ireland for Viking support. It was 100% a Viking community. And again, another one of these Norman castles. This one is in Sicily, and I actually have been in this building, and it just seems so out of place when you look all around it and you see these Italian structures and this Norman structure sitting there, but it's clearly Northern European. But all of these are in Sicily. Now, another trademark of the Norman occupation and the Viking interest in Europe, this is a church entrance on an English church. Notice the construction similarity to that Viking construction on the shipbuilding, and this is in Moscow. This is another site of the Viking success. The word Russian comes from the Viking ruler, Rus, who was in charge of the Viking settlement in where Moscow is today. So even to this day, the Russians owe their name to the Vikings. I don't know that they're claiming any connection to them, though. Dublin, as I already stated, founded by the Vikings, established and maintained clearly for over 400 years as a 100% Viking settlement. And then in the Ukraine, the influence of the Vikings as well. Ghost of the Vikings here in England, a typical English country house, shows that roof that looks similar to those structures that I showed you, and that sense of the appearance on the outside. They didn't dig down into the ground as much as the Vikings did, though. Another ghost of the Viking experience is how Parliament and in the Netherlands, both places where experiments in democracy were being worked on before anywhere else in Europe, this custom of having a gathering and an open place to speak about your ideas, it's unavoidable. It didn't happen anywhere in Italy. It doesn't happen anywhere in the other parts of Europe. It's a creation of the Vikings and the Norsemen, and it's an impact that's still being seen in British Parliament today. This is a contemporary Scandinavian home. I propose that it looks similar to that house that I showed you from the Viking era. It's a wide open space. They're known for their contemporary design. Again, this is a large interior of a Scandinavian home. Again, Benjamin Franklin commented that when he visited homes in their part of the world, he couldn't understand how come their houses were as warm as toast, and in Philadelphia, he was freezing. And the chimneys, he decided, had to be the difference. And he began experimenting with making the Franklin fireplace. But the Scandinavians had all figured out how to make heat rechannel itself through their stoves. They had it recycling, and they made warm spaces. And if you go to Scandinavia today, we may put double glazing on our window. They have quadruple glazing. Not only is the room warmer, but it's quieter. So they still are thinking heavily about design. And This is, again, more contemporary Scandinavian design. A chair, again, relationship. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with going out to get some Scandinavian goods for your home. When you would go to the store, you'll always see this kind of design, and you're inadvertently buying Scandinavian products. Now, people ask me, well, where are the Vikings today? What's happened to them? And my argument is, here they are. And so they haven't stopped. They're still doing exactly trade or raid, and you find them absolutely all throughout England, all throughout the United States, all throughout Scandinavia. And where they are is always dominated by this sense of design. They're still terrific designers. They're thinking all the time about how to make things more efficient, making products that are more sensible. And again, they're great workers of wood. They're still pretty good with metal. And something else that I heard a lecture on life in Iceland, and one of the things that the Icelanders claim is that being a Viking actually has made them more prepared to live in the modern world, because they were used to spending long periods of time inside in the winter and working on the Viking sagas and working in their shops, and it makes them ideally suited for working on computer programs and things like that, because it's the kind of practice that works in a kind of enclosed long space. Now, this is not my point of view. This is an Icelandic point of view in a contemporary interview and lecture process. But anyway, I myself simply know that once I started doing this research, I was astonished at the role that the Vikings had played in the development of what we call English, what we call Dutch, what we would even refer to as German society, the interest in design, the interest in organization, interdependence on groups, the idea of a parliamentary system of action, and last but not least, this concept of trade and raid. The Vikings made, through their advancements in boat building, made it possible for ships to be able to deal with crossing the Atlantic and sailing around the coast of Africa. And the relationship between Great Britain and the age of conquest and colony is absolutely clear. The idea of the Netherlands or Holland and Great Britain as being the two great sea powers of the 16th century, which is absolutely the truth, two small island countries living in the tradition of the Norsemen, who are their grandfathers and relatives from an earlier era, making it possible. Now, one of the interesting facts is that this policy that the Vikings begin in 973, by the end of the colonial era, which actually truly ended in 2006 with the last Portuguese colony in Macau being turned over to the people, there are only 7 countries in the world that were not under European influence in the entire history. Only 7 countries in the world. And the only one of those countries that is not in Asia is the country of Iran. And it may, in fact, be one of the reasons that they're being such a stick in the mud when it comes to dealing with the West, is that they have a long, long memory that, in fact, these people from the West have one thing on their mind, which is trade or raid. And, it's a staggering number when you realize that a little island called Great Britain could at one point have so many colonies, the entire country of India, much of Africa, all of the Americas, and so much of the territory under their control. I think that one has to simply look back and see where those thoughts came from, and I trace them to Lindisfarne in 793. So my argument is, I think the Vikings have got a bad deal. History isn't telling the story the way it should be told. They're not getting credit for what they did right. They only get credit for what they did wrong. And at the same time, when we look closely at what they did do, you can't help but marvel that they were exquisite in the business of design. And as IKEA goes to show, they are still pretty good at it. So with that, I close my Viking talk. Anybody have any questions? Nothing? Well, thank you. I appreciate it.